Right now, we welcome Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio to our center seat. Senator, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I know you gave a big speech today on the war on poverty. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, we want to talk about the news of the day and this Defense Secretary Gates book. Obviously, the focus, a lot of it is on Afghanistan and the policy there. I want to ask you about what you think about Afghanistan. The latest polls, Washington Post ABC poll says 66% of people say that the war in Afghanistan has not been worth fighting. 30% saying it has been worth fighting. You look at those numbers, and this is actually, there are other polls saying that it's actually more people in America are against the Afghan war. If it's a President Rubio, what are you doing in Afghanistan?
A couple things. Obviously, I understand why people feel that way. It's come at a tremendous price in both life and also injuries people have suffered, and clearly money as well. What's important to remember about Afghanistan is that it was the premier operational area in the world for jihadists to plan attacks against us, our interests around the world, and the West in general. And if in fact it becomes that again, and joining Syria in those ranks, by the way, the world becomes an even more dangerous place. So we have a significant interest in ensuring that the place does not devolve once again into a chaotic, ungoverned space where terrorist organizations can use it to undermine their neighbors and come after us. So we do have an interest in that. But that's mitigated. I mean, it's limited by, at the end of the day, it's the Afghans' responsibility. And they have a president now that is increasingly appears unstable and the direction he wants to take the country. There's questions about whether that election is even going to occur. So look, I think the U.S. should try to negotiate a deal where we have a presence there. We certainly have to downscale that war at some point. I think that should be happening as it is now. But at some point, you have to negotiate either some sort of long-term status of being there that's not overly aggressive.
But you would do that. You would do that with Karzai, and you would say...
Well, only if, for example, it's going to protect our soldiers. I mean, the numbers have to be at the right level. It can't be too high, but it has to be high enough so you're not just there protecting yourself. Otherwise, you're better off not being there at all. And especially if you're dealing with someone that's not going to give you assurances that your servicemen and women that are there are going to be protected. And both being able to defend themselves, but also, you know, having some level of immunity from, you know, rogue prosecutors and others on the ground there.
Do you think Secretary Gates should have written this book?
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, he has an opinion about what he wanted to write. He felt strongly about it, and I was surprised, as I said to you before we went on the air, that the book came out. But nothing in the book surprises me in the sense that I've been critical of the president's foreign policy and his views on national security. I think it's made the country less safe, largely because it hasn't been driven by a strategic foreign policy view. It's largely been driven by tactics and politics, and that's not a way to conduct foreign policy.
George.
In Iraq, after 8 years, twice as long as the Second World War, we pulled our troops out and things now look ominous in Iraq. There are people who say it wouldn't look ominous if we had a residual force there. Do you agree? If so, how big should it be, where should they be, and what would they do that would stop this?
Well, the residual force can be helpful in that regard, but ultimately residual force alone is not enough. You have to have a government in place that actually is able to provide for security and is functional. And many of the problems in Iraq track not just to the U.S. not being there, but to Maliki and to the decisions they've made internally there and the persecutions that have occurred there that have created the space for some of this to happen. And by the way, some of the stuff that's happening in Iraq is related to what's happening in Syria. You have now groups operating out of Syria, linked to al-Qaeda, that are crossing over and conducting operations in Iraq as well. So these things are all intertwined. So the answer to your question is yes, a U.S. presence there would have been useful, but would not have guaranteed that the situation in Iraq would not have devolved.
But how would it work? What would residual
Well, look, we have residual forces all over the world. I mean, obviously in different circumstances, but we certainly have been in South Korea for a significant period of time.
There's not a civil war going on in South Korea.
That's the point. I mean, that's why I got to the point about saying that the government there ultimately, and that's going to be the case in Afghanistan as well, has to be able to provide internal security on their own. If you don't have a functional government that can provide the basics of government, no residual force, I mean, it is going to ultimately guarantee the result we want. It's just not possible. Ultimately, it's in the Iraq belongs to Iraqis and Afghanistan belongs to Afghans. They ultimately have to be responsible for that.
Steve.
Is the war on terror over?
Oh, of course not. In fact, it's actually spread in ways that make it even more dangerous. You now see al-Qaeda elements and other terrorist elements creating strongholds in Africa. And Syria has become probably close to what Afghanistan looked like not so long ago. We've got issues in Afghanistan, Iraq. I worry about the stability of Jordan. Clearly, the stability of Lebanon's never been great. It's even more undermined now. And I think you look at some of the regional players and they see the U.S. as an unreliable partner in the region, and I think that is creating a vacuum whereby these individual countries are now pursuing their own agendas in ways, quite frankly, that are not in our national security interest.
If you go back to 2008, President Obama said that he would consider sending in U.S. troops back into Iraq if al-Qaeda were to establish that as a base of operations. Given what's happened in Ramadi, given what's happened in Fallujah, is that something you would consider?
Yeah, I don't think that's a viable option at this point. Now, clearly, if there are elements in Iraq carrying out attacks against the U.S., we would reserve options about being able to target and disrupt them. But in terms of a full-scale invasion and a return to Iraq, I don't think that's a proposal.
Something short of that? U.S. troops, something short
Well, again,
of that?
look, if there is a group out there that's planning and carrying out attacks against the U.S. or our national interests, every option should be on the table, including, targeted strikes that we conduct those all over in regions of the world now, and so that would have to be an option. But but in terms of like a U.S. return on the ground with boots on the ground in an invasion of Iraq, I think at that point that's not really what I think is a viable option. And more importantly, I would just say to you that it goes back to the point I made earlier, George. Iraq, at the end of the day, can't be saved if it doesn't have a government that can function. And there's only so much we could do. At some point, it's up to them, and I mean, those are the limits to our power, no matter what we try to do.
Juan.
Senator Rubio, earlier you said that President Obama really doesn't have a foreign policy, that he's responding to political demands being made. So I was interested in that because I'm thinking to myself, so President Rubio, as Bret Baier described you, has to make a choice here, because the president needs to respond to the will of the American people. In the poll that was cited earlier, 54% of Republicans say it's not worth being in Afghanistan right now. 60% of Republicans say remove most of the troops from Afghanistan. So would you ignore the will of the American people?
Well, first of all, what I said is he didn't have a strategic foreign policy. It was largely based on politics and on tactics. And a strategic foreign policy is one that outlines what our interests are. I give you as an example Syria. The president failed to make an argument to the American people why the conflict in Syria mattered. And he failed to make that well before we got into the situation about an authorization of action, etc. And you're seeing now why Syria mattered. It has become a premier operational area for terrorist organizations to organize and carry out attacks, not just in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, potentially in Jordan. And so we have a strategic interest in that.
So you're
it has
saying
a direct
President Rubio would send troops to Syria?
No, I've never called for actually even U.S. engagement militarily in Syria. What I called for a year and a half ago was for us to try to identify non-jihadist elements on the ground when this was possible and empower them, because I knew that in the absence of empowering them, you would create a vacuum, and that vacuum would be filled by who it's been filled by now, and that is foreign fighters, jihadists, terrorists, who are using Syria now and the chaos there.
So you would have sent more aid to the rebels, even though there were questions as to whether or not, picking up on Steve Hayes' question, they had ties to terrorist organizations.
Well, but early in the conflict, that was not the case. The foreign fighters and the al-Qaeda elements began to stream into Syria well into the conflict. In the initial stages of the conflict, there was the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility of identifying elements there who were not jihadists, who were Syrians, by the way. Many of these terrorists that are operating in Syria are not Syrians. They are foreign fighters that are coming in from Europe, in addition to other parts of the world. And by the way, are going to go back to Europe one day, and the Europeans are worried about it. And we had an opportunity early on to do that. That didn't happen. And as a result, you created this vacuum. And what is going to fill a vacuum? These terrorists. They realize there's this ungoverned area where there's chaos. That's a place we can set up terrorist camps. That's a place we can set up training operations. That's a place we can operate from. And that is what's happening in Syria right now.
Senator, we asked for people to tweet in and send us Facebook messages with questions. MGS tweeted in, how can the middle class survive with few good-paying jobs and rising mortgage rates?
Yeah, it's a fundamental question that we have in our country. Look, there's a lot of reasons why people are struggling, in the middle class in particular. One of them is that our economy has changed. A lot of the lower skill and middle skill jobs that provided a middle class living have gone away. They've either been outsourced or technology has replaced them, and either the ones that have remained don't pay enough to keep up with the cost of living. So the only way to address that is two things. First, you have to have a robust free enterprise economy. not a corporatist economy or crony capitalist one, a truly free enterprise one where these sorts of better paying jobs are being created. And then the other is you've got to give people the skills for these new jobs, because these new jobs require a higher level of skill and education than jobs used to require in the past. And we have to address both of those. And I think that's true whether it's eradicating poverty and dealing with inequality of opportunity, or whether it's helping the middle class stay in the middle class and prosper beyond it.
George.
In your speech today on poverty, you took note of something people have been talking about for the 50 years since Moynihan gave his famous report. You said that in 1963, 7% of American children were born to unmarried mothers. Today, 40% are.
Right.
Since the family is the primary transmitter of social capital, and the family disintegration correlates with all the problems of poverty. Two questions. What caused this? We've seen family disintegration and war, famine, and pestilence. This was in a prosperous America. And what can government do about it?
Well, the first thing, I mean, largely the erosion of family and marriage in particular is the result of cultural and social changes that have occurred in our country, for which government has a limited role that it can play. I think what government can do is serve as a catalyst for recognition that, look, the statistics are unquestionable. 70-some-odd% of families with children living in poverty are not headed by a married couple. And there's practical reasons for that. I mean, a marriage means 2 paychecks. And there's social reasons for that as well. But I do think government's role I do think government has a role in the following sense, and that is making sure our policies don't discourage marriage. We have safety net programs like Medicaid that punish marriage. If you get married, you could lose that benefit. That's also true to some extent in the tax code. So I think it's important. Marriage is a critical part of success. It is the single greatest eradicator of poverty that we know, and it's not a government program. But it is a social issue. For people that say that social issues and economic issues are not intertwined, marriage proves that that's not necessarily true.
Steve.
You mentioned the tax code. Back in 2010, when I was following you around Florida, doing a story on you, you talked to a voter and indicated a willingness to consider something like major tax reform along the lines of a consumption-based tax or a fair tax. Is that still something that you think is a viable idea?
It is. The problem is that in Washington is right now not really conducive to doing big pieces of legislation.
Beyond
like
the Obama
immigration
administration.
reform?
Well, that's true too. I mean, if you think
that's essentially
yeah,
it,
I mean that's
right?
I mean so that's an accurate assessment of where we are today. I mean, look at the condition and the state of affairs in Washington. Look at the last few big pieces of legislation that have come from here, and there's not only not an appetite to do it that way. Quite frankly, it's not functional at this point to be able to deal things in that perspective. I think that's true for immigration. I think that's true for taxes. I think that might be true in an issue like poverty, unfortunately, as well. So that's the problem with it. But I do think there are reforms to the tax code that could allow us to create a more vibrant private enterprise economy. You know, things that, for example, the corporate tax. I mean, the corporate tax is encouraging companies to invest and reinvest overseas. And that's a direct competitive disadvantage for us. There are jobs that are not being created in the United States because our tax code puts us at a competitive disadvantage. And that's just on the rate side. Imagine, that's also true on the complexity side.
Here are tonight's Bing highlights. Women agreed most when Senator Rubio said he is not sure Secretary Gates should have written his book. The highest intensities of the segment, 2, was 21,000 votes per minute when Senator Rubio said, of course, the war on terror is not over. Total votes tonight, almost 200,000. Finally tonight, thought I'd end with another Twitter question since we had so many of them. Linda writes in to Senator Rubio, how can Republicans from the far right and moderates come together for voting in 2016? Senator, don't have much time, but what do you think?
We have to do it in 2014 first. And I think the one thing that unites all Republicans and most Americans is the belief that the way forward for prosperity is the combination of free enterprise and limited government. Limited government doesn't mean indifference. It means an effective government that does what it's supposed to do, but not more than that. And free enterprise, which is the single greatest economic engine of social mobility in human history.
The differences between the two sides of the party, though, can be worked out not only this year, but ahead of a big presidential.
I think that's an agenda that unites all Republicans. As far as the tactics and the strategies about the best way to pursue that, there may be a healthy debate. No different than what Democrats had a few years ago themselves.